My name's Scott Hickey. I'm just started with Mutual of Omaha as a principal enterprise architect. I'd done some consulting for about 7 years or so over the past 15 years at Mutual. I'm really excited to be an employee with Mutual. What I'm going to do is really talk about what Ben was talking about earlier. Who was in the talk that Ben just gave? So quite a few people. So really we're going to build on what he talked about and how we implemented a lot of what he's talking about. And my goal is to just really give you an overview. It's going to be hard to do a lot in 45 minutes. So my goal is to kind of explain how we've tried to implement what he was talking about. And what we implemented, by the way, really was done with a lot of Sterling's help from Gradle. He spent a couple weeks with us at Mutual of Omaha and really helped us get started. Probably hard to overstate how much we appreciated what he did for us in those 2 weeks. Ben helped us. John Engelman from Object Partners also spent a few days with us as well. So our team really built on a lot of what they did. Important part of our team is Tim Preston, who's also from Mutual of Omaha up here. And so if there's questions that you ask and I don't know the answer to, Tim will probably have the answer to those as well. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of what our environment looks like. And then I'll show you what our builds look like for the projects we've been doing, and try to dive into the interesting bits of code or challenges. And the idea is not that you're going to have, so I'm not going to give you like a sample project. It's really, the goal of this talk is to kind of show you where our challenges were, show you what we were driving towards, and hopefully give you some pointers to where to look. Everyone's environment is really going to be different. And so it's not that cookie cutter, I don't think. So, Mutual of Omaha is a Fortune 500 insurance company, lots of apps, and what we've been trying to do. So we're not Netflix, we're not LinkedIn, we're not producing one product that gets continuously built over and over again. The main business is insurance, and there's a lot of apps that are built to support that. A small portion of which are public facing. So our needs are a little bit different probably than in, say, a startup. Mostly a IBM shop, but trying not to be, like a lot of other Fortune 500 companies that I've ran into. But there's a, typical workflow might be somebody working on Eclipse or RAD. They check in code, and then at some point, we have Jenkins set up, and they can go into Jenkins and they can go ahead and run a build, and it'll run the unit tests or compile the code, run the unit tests, and then one of the parameterized options in Jenkins is to decide if you want to publish it or not. And if we publish it, we were publishing it into Ivy, and then at some point in time, someone will say, hey, can we start testing this? And we have a homegrown Grails app that we use that will pull artifacts from Ivy and deploy them to our integration, customer acceptance test, or prod environments. And it's all, pretty manual is what was happening, what's been happening. We're trying to improve on that and make that a little better. And so some of the things that we've been trying to do are things like add a post-commit hook so that every time someone commits code, the build runs, instead of having it just be episodic. And then all the build scripts have been written in Ant. We wanted to move those to Gradle. A lot of the build scripts are cut and paste, like at a lot of companies that have used Ant. And just like the problems you would have with cut and paste code, right? You have hundreds or thousands of copies of that code with slight variations. You can't tell what's changed, what's not changed. It doesn't really give you the ability to manage or take advantage of a lot of reuse if you want to do that. So we really wanted to change our build technology from Ant to Gradle so we could have the full power programming language in our build. The other thing that we wanted to do is we've really been trying to figure out how to capture business knowledge through functional tests. So we have a lot of systems that were built with older technologies that are harder to test. You can't really bolt unit tests on. And so we're really trying to capture how those apps should work in functional tests. Mutual of Omaha is not the only company I've seen where a company will build an application, especially internally developed ones, and it might not get touched for 5 or 7 or 10 years. It does the thing it needs to do. It does it well. It fills that particular need for that business process. And then what happens over time, of course, is if you need to upgrade a platform or someone needs to make a slight change, that knowledge of trying to actually track down from a developer perspective how the app was really supposed to work can be a challenge. It's hard to find the BA who knows why the app works the way it does. And so we were trying to figure out if we could, when we upgrade the platforms that applications run on, can we add some functional tests to capture that, the behavior of the app? And we would really like to just, after a build, go ahead and deploy that onto some kind of CI server, run functional tests against that, and then deploy. Then publish to Artifactory. So we've decided to replace Ivy with Artifactory. And we were manually managing artifacts in Ivy. We've set up Artifactory to go ahead and automatically proxy JCenter and Spring Source and Maven Central so that we're not in the business of manually having to add stuff to Ivy. We still have our Grails app that'll do deployments. So anyway, this is the environment we've been trying to work towards. And really, we're more concerned about continuous integration and not necessarily continuous, certainly not continuous deployment, and really not even concerned necessarily about continuous delivery. We just want to make sure that we can get the feedback when we're making changes to code. Get that feedback back to the developers and we're really trying to change the culture that existed. Again, I've seen this in a lot of IBM shops. The build process is file export error war from RAD. Trying to get rid of that and get the builds happening off the developer workstation. So this is the environment that we're moving to, kind of the infrastructure part of it. Our goal really is to make the builds easier for the developers. We have a lot of developers that don't know and don't care about Ant, or don't know and don't care about Gradle. We have, talking about, again, our business is not to produce one piece of software or a couple variations of a piece of software. We have about 1/3 of the existing web apps in Jenkins today, but not on this pipeline. So we're trying to move these apps to the pipeline. So 2/3 of them aren't even in Jenkins, and right now we have about 1,200 Jenkins jobs. So we're talking about a lot of jobs that we have to try to manage for the enterprise. So we're really trying to focus on how can we, and a lot of them look similar. So how can we onboard projects, existing projects as well as new ones, into a continuous pipeline environment and keep it as simple as possible for the average development team. So we want to capture standards that we have in the company, but we don't necessarily need people to worry about that. And we certainly don't want to cut and paste things like, here's the URL to Artifactory, and this is how you aggregate your JUnit test results and your integration test results. It's like, these teams are doing the same thing over and over again. So we'd really like the build file, which in Ant is fairly large right now, and shrink that down to something as small as possible. So let me show you what the end product is for where we're at right now. This is the Gradle build for a portlet that we have. We have one of the initial projects we've been putting onto this pipeline is a set of 50 portlets that actually do make up a customer-facing application. And so what we've done is decided to create a set of plugins that capture the kinds of common things that we're trying to do. So if we know that we're going to be deploying to, or doing our builds on Jenkins, we know we're going to be doing a deploy for doing the functional tests, and we want to execute these functional tests using Selenium, for instance. And then we know if it's a portlet, we know a whole bunch of things. We already know it's a Java app. Actually, let me go over to some notes here so I don't talk out of turn. the portlet conventions actually, they're going to wrap conventions for wars. And we have a war conventions that captures a lot of our Java conventions and our common conventions and static code analysis stuff. So instead of having to add all those plugins individually, the portlet team, if they're going to create a new project, can just go over and they can add, oops, let me pull up the other one there. They can add, apply portlet conventions, and they're going to get all that stuff, which is great. And it just doesn't change. For those types of apps, they all get built the same way. We have a description for the project, and we have the group that's going to be used for when we do the group and module, set up that for publishing. The dependencies aren't that interesting. I mean, obviously people are going to have to specify what it is that they're trying to do. So the plugin conventions help us capture the Gradle things that we're doing over and over again for the similar projects. And then, like Ben was describing, we're really trying to implement a pipeline, and the pipeline view that looks something like this, where on every commit, there's a build that happens and tests run, and you have the option to click on a button, and after the build runs, that we publish to a snapshot. That happens automatically, and then you can click on a button to publish to a release candidate or promote something to release. So we're trying to implement that pipeline that he was talking about before. Right now, the Jenkins jobs, I mean, prior to us building this continuous integration platform, those were all created manually. And there's a couple problems with that. One of them is who wants to be the job of creating the 1,200 Jenkins jobs that are out there? Who wants that to be their daily task? But more importantly, I talked about this problem of, or challenge of, a lot of apps get built and they might not get touched for several years. Well, it's great that we have a reproducible build in Jenkins in the sense that we can run a Gradle task and that Gradle build file is checked into version control. But what about the environment on the build server that built that? Is Jenkins going to look the same 3 years from now? I mean, or will those jobs, somebody could have gone in and edited those jobs, deleted the jobs. We don't really know what it took to set up the build jobs for that. So we would like to capture that as well. So if there was something special that was done, we would like that to be part of the code that was checked in along with the build, the normal build process, I guess, for creating an artifact. So we were looking at that problem and trying to figure out how to solve that. And what we decided to do, we took a couple different approaches. We looked at there's a Jenkins job DSL that has a Jenkins plugin that allows you to write some Groovy DSL code. And you can put that in a file or paste that into a Jenkins job, and that will generate other jobs. And that's a good solution, except that you really run into this problem of how do I manage the seed job? You've got this code that generates the Jenkins jobs. Well, where do I put that? Does that go in one project? Does it go in my current project? So do I have to check out my whole project just to get that one file? And then I'm going to end up probably with a seed job for every project. So now I could end up with hundreds or thousands of these seed jobs in addition to the regular jobs. And that didn't feel like a great solution. So then we looked at Gary Hale's Gradle Jenkins plugin, which allows you to define Jenkins jobs inside of Gradle. And that's really a pretty neat plugin. And it will take advantage of letting you can define your jobs using XML templates, but you can also use that Groovy DSL, the job DSL, for creating jobs. So you can have a Jenkins block, put those inside your build file, and capture your build jobs that way. And that, I think it's the Jenkins job DSL. So what was the name of the plugin? There's the Jenkins job DSL plugin, and that one is the core DSL. In that is what is available to you from the Gradle Jenkins plugin. And that's really nice, except that our jobs don't look as simple as what maybe like what Ben was doing in his demo. They're a lot more complicated, and there's a lot of boilerplate really to creating that, and we don't want to cut and paste. We don't want to replace cutting and pasting Ant stuff with cutting and pasting Groovy DSL code. So what we decided to try to do is create a library over that DSL, the job DSL, that we can include inside a Jenkins block in our build script, and that's really what this represents here. And there's still some boilerplate, so but this is getting us pretty close to what we were trying to get to, where we have this concept of an ASI. It's like, think of it as a department, roughly, inside of a company. So all the software is tagged with this identifier, and that drives how we'll create a lot of things. We've got a project name, we've got the URL, and we have this, again, this is some boilerplate that still needs to go away. But this is the really interesting part. I mean, this is the part we were trying to get to. What I'd really like to do for any given project is say, in Jenkins, I'm going to use this helper class that we built, and I'm going to define what my server should be. We're using the CloudBees folder plugin to put all of our jobs inside of a folder. So we'll have the jobs plus the pipeline inside of that folder. And that, because if you think about it, if you have thousands of jobs, then you really don't want all those sitting, in your root view. It also helps us do a little bit better job with the naming. And then, each one of these creates a Jenkins job. In addition, what we're saying is I'm going to have a folder that all these jobs are going to live in, and I'm going to treat these jobs as a pipeline. So I'm going to create a pipeline view, assuming I start with this job and finish with this. And this is working really slick right now. Again, there's some duplicate, kind of some boilerplate here that I'll talk about later that we'd like to make go away. But this is really a pretty simple build file, if you think about it from, yes?
So these jobs, they're defined in the pipeline in that order?
Yes.
So are you creating the jobs? Like, how are you reporting the order then?
I will talk about how we're creating the order for these pipeline views just a little bit later. Okay. I'll show you how we did that. That's, I guess, one of the interesting bits that I wanted to show. But just taking a step back, so this as a goal feels pretty good to me. I mean, I've got some conventions I'm applying at the top. I have my dependencies, which, every team's got to manage that. You got to put it somewhere, right? Whatever your build system is. And then I've got a really pretty small chunk of code here defining the pipeline. And this is definitely a, we're piloting this to about 15 to 20 apps right now to get some feedback. There's different theories about, well, if your pipeline looks the same, shouldn't you just create one method for all of that versus, having this as kind of boilerplate. But on the other hand, I think this communicates something to the team about what you're really doing. There's not a right answer. I like this. The part that I really like about this is not just that we created these helper methods, but I like it that those helper methods can all take a closure as well. So those helper methods encapsulate blocks of DSL. And one of the assumptions that's made, for instance, on the build and test job is that the trigger is going to work a certain way. But you can go ahead and add a block and define a trigger and basically override the default trigger using the Jenkins job DSL. So we have some parameters that can be passed in as properties, and all these method signatures really take a map and then a closure. So we have some things that we want to provide as properties, but the rest of it, you can go ahead and put the DSL code right in here and change that default job. And that's, I think, really powerful because it gets us as a continuous integration team out of the business of every time when somebody says, well, I want to customize the trigger, or I need to do something different with, my build and test doesn't use Jacoco, so I want to do something different. Actually, we handle that. I'll show you that a little bit differently. But anyway, the point is that you could put in your own DSL right there, the Jenkins job DSL, and you don't have to come to us as a team and say, I need to customize. I need to have a special method created for this one thing I'm trying to do. Yes?
So when you start a new project or a new build pipeline, you run this thing once.
So yeah, so what's great is, yes, so the
What if it's wrong and you need to erase it, delete all the jobs?
So the question was, you run this once and it creates it, but then how does it, what happens if it changes? So that seed job problem it's a big deal. And so the solution that we're comfortable with is, the developer lead on a team can go to the command line if they want to update jobs and just, let's see here. They can just run Gradle W, update Jenkins items is the new term. And what will happen is this will go out, it'll process this DSL, basically creating the XML for all those jobs. And when it gets done doing that, it will go ahead and prompt you for your user ID and password because it knows you're trying to publish those to a certain server. So then as a developer lead, you can authenticate against that server, and it'll create those jobs initially. And then if you look at our pipeline, so here it is. It's going off and creating these jobs, and at this point, it's going to prompt me for my user ID and password for our customer acceptance test Jenkins server. And if I authenticate, it'll go ahead and update those jobs. So that once they're created once, from that point on, if you look back at the pipeline, the first job, well, actually, let's look at the source code. That's better. The first job in the pipeline is update Jenkins items. So what's going to happen is the first step in the pipeline is going to run the same task that I just ran, which will go ahead and update all the jobs. So if you change, so if I need, for instance, to change my build and test job, so that, say, I want to do something different in, in Gradle. So I can override the default Gradle task, which is test in Jacoco. And I can just say, maybe I just want to say test. Maybe I don't want to run code coverage. So I can go ahead and change this file, check it in. On commit, the first thing that happens is update Jenkins items runs, and it's going to change all these jobs if update them if they've changed. So I don't have to keep manually rerunning stuff. And what this also does is it guarantees that whatever the jobs are that are running are the things that were checked in, which is the whole point behind a reproducible build, right? We want our Jenkins jobs to get created the way we defined in code. And that works really well. Obviously, the only issue would be is if you're going to try to update the Jenkins items job, you would have to do that outside this process, but yes? So the helper methods, I will talk about that. I will talk about where our helper methods are in just a second, actually shortly. But I feel pretty good about this. I think, our team is happy with the fact that we're not going to create a bunch of seed jobs. The Jenkins jobs will self-update. This feels like the right amount of, we could put this in a Confluence page and people can add that to a build file. It communicates what's being done, but it's not, you don't have to really know much about Gradle to be able to read the DSL and understand, what it's doing. Feels like the right solution for what we're trying to accomplish, at least. So let me walk through the stuff that's changed, or the things that we're doing. So we do, in our Gradle wrapper, we point to a custom version of Gradle where we add some init scripts. So we'll set up our build script dependencies to point at Artifactory, and that's where we have our plugins, and that's where we have the DSL helper jar file. So that's a separate project. So we really have a Gradle plugins project where we build all of our plugins, and we have this DSL helper project where we do the DSL. So so let me flip back over here to some notes. Let's see here. So we've got, this is kind of the list of plugins that we've built, and I won't go into all of them, but the good thing to know is, I guess, it's a mixture of, like the functional test does some Selenium setup, and the Java task helps configure our Maven publish so we can publish right, and there's a standard for creating Java docs and sources a certain way at Mutual of Omaha. So these tasks kind of capture, that level of granularity, but then we've also got higher level ones like a portlet, which wraps up all of those. So our goal is to kind of have, compose higher level plug-in functionality with lower level ones. So that way, if your build doesn't match, you're just like the portlet build, except you do one thing different. You don't have to use the portlet one. You can use the stuff the portlet one uses. But for the other 99% of them, they can just drop one item into their build file, and they get the default company project standards. So we have that, and then like I was saying, we have a custom distribution. So we have 3 files that we set up, where we set up some custom Gradle stuff. We go ahead and point our Artifactory URL. We set that to by default, and we also, all of our tools, we have that URL that we set by default. And what we do is, in the setup, in our Gradle file, if we're doing local testing, we can set these flags in our Gradle properties file so that, for instance, the tools repo, if we're not wanting to pull plugins from Artifactory, but we want to pull them from our local workspace, we can go ahead and say, I'm going to use the local Mutual of Omaha Gradle plugins, or I want to use a local version of the job DSL library. And then we won't add those to the build script. Inside of the setup for Gradle, we'll go ahead and add those manually to our test project. So we'll just go into the build script dependencies and point at the jar that we're building locally. So this has been really nice. So you don't have to deploy stuff, build it and publish it into snapshots over and over again if you don't want to, just to test out and experiment. So we can kind of experiment locally. So this is having the Gradle distribution helps us with some of that, and like I said, it just helps us set up, like things like the Artifactory URL. Let's see here. So that's we've got the Gradle properties. Again, we're defining some of this stuff. We're using our custom distribution for the wrapper, and then I've shown you what it looks like to use. We're including these custom plugins. You've seen what that Jenkins block looks like. So some of the challenges that we had with so building the pipeline is harder than it sounds. So let me just touch base on a few of the challenges that we had, and let me grab some notes here. So again, I pointed out setting these properties. So Tim especially has been really helpful with recognizing when we're developing stuff and we want to develop quicker changes to plugins and the DSL stuff. We really put some work into thinking about how can we configure where Gradle points to when it's running, so we can write test code and experiment locally without having to publish stuff. And you could think, well, I could just point at snapshots, but the problem is he's working on something and I'm working on something, and we're just trying to see if it works. And if we're both publishing the snapshots, we're going to end up stepping on each other. So you really need a way to kind of test this stuff locally. So putting a little bit of thought into that and doing that inside the initd and the Gradle distribution really helped. the just, I mean, this may be obvious, but kind of a quick tip for us was we didn't do this right away. We were trying to convert existing projects because we wanted to make sure we were building something for real. It didn't take very long before we realized we just needed a simple canary project that, like a Spring Boot app that just has one service and one functional test and one unit test, so that when you're doing the development on the plugins and on the DSLs, you can turn that around really fast. You don't want to pull in your real dependencies. It just takes a lot longer to do that. So to create the build pipeline, if you had a fixed pipeline, let me back up for a second. So if you're going to build a pipeline in Jenkins, you have to tell Jenkins there's an option to trigger the next build, but you have to know what the next build is. So if you had a fixed pipeline, you could put that in a set of enums and know what the next one's going to be and drive the name and build your DSL for that. But we really realized that different jobs have different needs. So some people really want to publish a snapshot and then run functional tests. They want to do a deploy and then run functional tests. And other teams said, it made more sense to build your artifact, deploy it, run the functional tests. If the functional tests pass, then go ahead and create the snapshot. So we knew that a default ordering would make sense, but that was going to be something that we didn't want to lock people into. So what we ended up doing in the DSL helper code, and I'll jump over to that, is those helper methods. At the top of each one of those, they create what we call this base Jenkins job. So the DSL by default is going to create this, what the Gradle Jenkins plugin calls a Jenkins job object. And what we did is, instead of letting the DSL create it from our Gradle definition, we created those inside of this helper method. So we actually manage that life cycle. So we go ahead and we're using a Groovy category. So the Jenkins, when you see the Jenkins with the curly brace, really that's a Jenkins configuration object that's defined in the Gradle Jenkins plugin. So we can use that to get a handle to jobs, get a handle. I'm sorry, I should have made this bigger. That helps. Feel free to tell me to make it bigger or whatever. Anyway, you can see here, so I'm creating at the top, let's see, I've got some code. This is actually for creating a folder. I've got other code for creating a job. Let me find that here. That's the view, I'm sorry. Here's the job code. So here, we're going ahead and creating, let's see, create base Jenkins. Oh yeah, right here, I'm sorry. So this is going ahead and actually creating the Jenkins job. So now we have a handle to the job, which we didn't have before. And one of the things I have to do is I actually have to put that in an ordered list, because I don't have any other way of knowing how those jobs were defined. So that's the workaround, I guess, for trying to build the pipeline without a predefined order. Somehow I have to be able to capture that at creation and know what that job was and put it in an ordered list. So this is really what we're doing here, is creating an empty job, and then this helper method goes ahead and runs some basic DSL. So that was the first challenge that we had to overcome in trying to build a pipeline automatically. The second challenge was that we didn't start out thinking we were going to use the CloudBeast folder, but we actually found out that with the latest version of Jenkins and the latest version of the pipeline view would throw an exception and take down Jenkins if you were trying to create that pipeline view in your like default all view in Jenkins. So obviously that was a problem. Plus we just didn't like the fact that our job names were ugly, because they all had like the project name in front of them, and what we really preferred and are much happier with is we have a folder view that looks like this, where the folder is the name of the project, and then we can just have jobs that are just called build, publish, promote. I think this is a much nicer way to consume the jobs that are there, and of course, and then we can just put the pipeline view inside that.
Why did you said you said you thought it was a really good idea to use the CloudBees folders?
Yes. Yeah, so that our top level view just has a bunch of folders in it instead of having all like 8 jobs times 1,000, right? Or whatever it would be.
I mean, wouldn't you want to create a bunch of views, one per job type?
So we create one folder for each project, essentially, right? And then we have one pipeline view that sits inside that folder along with all of the jobs. Yeah, I'm sorry, if I didn't make that obvious. So this is inside the folder. So if I back up, I might. So here's a view of a whole bunch of folders, and these jobs are all breaking because our portlet theme has changed. But if you're wondering why that looks that way, but yeah, the idea is that we have a bunch of folders, and then you can click into the folder view, and you can see the jobs. This is what that's the pipeline view. So this is inside the folder view, is what you see by default. And then you've got the pipeline tab right next to it. Yes?
So with respect to the names of those Jenkins jobs, are they unique across the whole space or just within that folder?
Yeah, so the folder acts like a namespace. So the question is, are these jobs unique? Names unique, and they are because they're kind of they're namespaced. It's just a tree structure on the file system.
You don't have to get too long.
Yeah, which is really nice because we were doing that, and we really didn't like it. I mean, it's really hard to read. It's much nicer to have the folder again that just represents that project, and then have these really short names right here.
But the CloudBees folder, is that the CloudBees?
Yes, the question is that the CloudBees folder plugin? And yes, it is. And so let me jump ahead here to, because I'm just going to run out of time highlighting some of the other challenges. So the create items, let me go back to the job DSL here. So the create items, so creating Jenkins items, or jobs, those are just XML files. So the job DSL plugin that runs on Jenkins is just writing files to the XML. Writing those XML files to the file system. So it just can create that folder and drop those things in. So the DSL does have support for folders. What's happening with the Gradle plugin, the Gradle Jenkins plugin, is it's using REST calls to try to do the same thing. Well, the REST API is different for if I'm going to create something in the root view versus creating something inside of a folder. So so we had to, and luckily there was a place to override the create, get, update, and delete inside the Jenkins, the Gradle Jenkins plugin. So for creating jobs, creating folders, creating the pipeline view, we could namespace, put that namespace in the REST call, because otherwise, it would throw up with whatever the REST. It didn't know what the REST API didn't understand how to put a folder over here. You had to put it on the URI string, not as part of the parameter for what you were trying to create. So that was a challenge. That took.
I noticed you're using with instead of just passing folders down below there.
Yeah.
Is there a special reason you're using?
No. The question was, is there a special reason for using with? And the answer is no. Let's see here. So we have the ordered list. We figured out, we got over the challenge of how to create the folders and put stuff in folders. The ordered list lets us create the pipeline view correctly. When we get done, we can process that list and set that up. Let's see here. One of the weird things that we just had to deal with was the fact that, so here I've got this build and unit test job helper method. So I go ahead and create that base job and, maybe configure the Gradle task slightly different. But then what I have to do is really figure out what the previous job was in the pipeline and go change that so that it knows that the next downstream job is the one I just created. So kind of had to add this kind of code at the end of every step in the pipeline in order to get those downstream jobs set up. So that was, you know, I don't know, just added a little complexity to setting up this helper. Let's see here. And we've really already talked about the self-updating part of this. So again, the first job in all of this is to go ahead and just set up, you know, update the Jenkins jobs. And so I've got 5 minutes left. I know that's kind of a whirlwind overview of what we're doing, but let's take some questions. Yes?
Just a quick question. Are these files available publicly?
No. And it's you know, I've looked at trying to create, so are these files available publicly? I mean, this has a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, some of it could probably be extracted.
Well, it seems like you've got some lessons learned in there.
And really, the right thing to do is to, you know, actually, so some of this should probably be pull requests back to the original projects because there's different challenges. So another one of the gotchas that I had is, so I implemented this as a Groovy category. Something changed in the job DSL plugin between 129 and 130, and Groovy categories are broken in that. So we kind of ran into some problems with getting the different versions of stuff lined up, but I haven't gone through and tried to piece apart all of the stuff to create an empty project, I guess, that would do all this. Yes?
When I do this, I have a challenge with the Jenkins plugin because it keeps updating. You might go through the situation when you want to introduce the new Jenkins plugin, and it's a part of a job. And then how are you going to keep your library up to date with the new Jenkins plugin applied to the job, or the need to get it deprecated or updated with the new Jenkins version? So you have a job that looks maybe 10 plugins inside the job, right? And then how you keep that?
So the question is, how do you keep everything in sync, basically, across all these versions? And the answer is, like, very carefully. I mean, we've been talking about that. So that, you know, it's the good thing and bad thing about this model, right? Is that we're dependent on a whole bunch of projects, Jenkins plugins, Gradle plugins, all of which are maintained by different people and not necessarily in sync.
The plugin is not always open enough for you to be able to override the setting.
So I mean, this gets so the question was, or comment was that, so the plugin's not always open enough to override those settings. So this is where you know, I mean, this is you have to decide which way you want to go, right? I mean, we've also been down. I mean, we're trying to get off of proprietary stuff because we've also had problems in other, maybe not with build systems in particular, but in general, with vendors not willing to update stuff to make it do what we want to do. I would much rather work with some open source tools. And you know, the nice thing is it wasn't that hard to dive into the source code, you know, for the Gradle Jenkins plugin and figure out what I wanted to do from the job creation perspective. And but it's absolutely, the onus is on us to say, these are the challenges I've had, like the folder support doesn't work. Well, I should try to commit something back or submit a pull request back. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge. When you have all these moving parts, you know, we really have to be careful. Yes?
Could you show us the like one Jenkins configuration, please?
Yes. And that's,
What they look like once they're created?
yeah, and that's to me, that's a great part of this story, right? Is that you know, someone has to in the past manually go in, and I won't spend a ton of time walking through all these options, but as I scroll through this, you know, that build and test, there is a ton of stuff going on here, and most of it the users, the developers really don't care about. right? I mean, they know they want to. So what they really care about is the fact that we're kicking off test in Jacoco, you know, and how it's triggered.
So you're not using the workflow, the Jenkins workflow DSL plugin?
No, we're using the build pipeline, the build pipeline plugin, not the workflow plugin. I think those are two different plugins.
Yes, there's a way to write these configurations as a single, workflow program that they were showcasing it last year at the Jenkins user conference. But you're just using the traditional Jenkins configuration, right?
Yes, yeah, these are just, yep, exactly. I mean, and that's really what the, you know, we're really using what the Jenkins job DSL provides us, you know, to create these jobs. Yes?
We're going to talk about, maybe you already mentioned this, about how you ensure the ordering between the different tasks.
So the order between so ensuring the order, so the question was, how do you ensure the order in the pipeline? So as these jobs, let me pull up the build.gradle, let's see here, make sure I'm looking at the right one, sorry. So when we look at this build.gradle here, we're not letting the job creation happen. Let me say it this way. The job creation is happening inside of these methods. So we take the configuration and we say job create. And when we create those, we put them, so the category keeps track of a list of the jobs as they are created. And they're created in order so that we have that. So once we have that list, when we get down to the create pipeline view, we can go down. Well, actually, we use that list in two ways. Actually, we don't need it, for the pipeline view. We need it for the trigger, the downstream triggers. So this is what I was showing before. So so in the build and test job, I get that from this list. So I need to know what the previous job was so that after I create this job, I can update that job and say my downstream job is going to be the one I just created. Does that answer your question?
Do you get parallelization too?
Do we get, pardon?
Like, can you have two jobs running in parallel?
I think so the question is, can you have jobs running in parallel? I haven't looked at trying to do that. I would think that we could set that up because it's just really, you know, your job configuration. And with the Jenkins job DSL, you can pretty much configure the jobs any way you want. I mean, the DSL supports a lot of functionality, and if that functionality is not wrapped up in a nice DSL, you can still use these config blocks to basically shove whatever the XML would be to make that happen. The comment was the DSL does support a parallel, okay. Let's see here, and I've gone a few minutes over. If anyone has, you know, if you have other questions, feel free to grab me afterwards or talk to Tim as well, and you know, we'll be more than happy to talk to you after we're done here.
I've got a quick question for you and maybe for the audience as well. I'm using the delivery pipeline plugin, which is almost the same as the build pipeline plugin. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the difference. I was wondering whether that was a conscious choice to use the build pipeline or the other one, and if you know the difference. And
yeah, you know what? Very early on, I think we looked at a couple different options, and we're working with Sterling on some of those, and he was aware of the workflow plugin, but I'm not sure. I don't know how mature it was at the time that we started looking at this, and this seems to do what we want it to do for right now, at least.
I don't see any difference from what I'm able to do with the other plugin,
So,
but I was curious in case there was something I was missing or additional capability.
yeah.
Does anybody have experience with the delivery pipeline plugin?
Workflow versus the pipeline.
Not the workflow. There's another pipeline plugin called
Okay.
delivery pipeline. I think it's built on top of this one.
I had an experience. The only problem that I saw is that you cannot pass parameter to the first job. So you cannot, for example, we need to pass the version number through the pipeline, and we can do that through the pipeline.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.